Welcome back. I'm Max Bergman, director of the Stewart Center and Europe-Russia-Eurasia program at CSIS.
And I'm Maria Snegovaya, senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia.
And you're listening to Russian Roulette, a podcast discussing all things Russia and Eurasia from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. When Left Moves Right, the decline of the left and the rise of the populist right in post-communist Europe. This is the title of the exciting new book from Dr. Maria Snegovaya, our very own CSIS senior fellow here on the Europe-Russia-Eurasia program. The book is out today from Oxford University Press. As our regular viewers know, Maria is known for her Russia commentary. This book is a little bit different. It is focused on the politics of Europe, in particular the politics of post-communist Eastern Europe, and essentially how the politics have shifted over the last number of years, and particularly over the last few decades. We are also joined today by Dr. Dan Kellerman. Dan, thanks so much for joining us. He's joining us all the way from Portugal. Dan is a senior associate non-resident fellow as part of the Europe-Russia-Eurasia program here at CSIS. He is also the McCourt Chair at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University, where he focuses on the European Union, law and politics, comparative political economy, and comparative policy. So, Maria, let's jump right into the book. Congratulations, first of all. It's out today. Everyone should run to the store. Well, first watch the event, then run to the store and buy the book, or you can buy it online. But Maria, let me give you the floor. Why don't you sort of give an outline of what the book is about and why you wrote it.
Yeah, and thank you very much. I wanted to start by thanking the CSIS, Max and Dan, for taking time to do this for me. To our audiences, so first of all, as a School of Russia, why do I also focus on post-communist Europe? Well, it's kind of ironic in the sense that at the time when I started a deep dive into my PhD, it was back in 2013, and it felt like Russia was off the radar in political science. So much for our ability to forecast the future. And certainly the populism was hot, and there was something that attracted attention, just as Viktor Orban made his prominent speech about the illiberal democracy. So I was really fascinated by this topic. But then, of course, the relevance of the topic kept fluctuating, and by the time I finally signed the contract, I was quite disappointed, thinking that nobody will be interested. Well, go figure. Unfortunately, for better or worse, I guess for better for me and worse for the rest of the world, potentially, the topic still remains quite relevant in 2024 as well. And to our audiences, I wanted to flag that one of the key motivations behind writing it, for me, as I call myself a recovering economist, since my recent undergrad is actually in econ, and then I later shifted into political science, was to try and understand the basic foundations of sustainability of contemporary democracy. So the key kind of inspiration goes beyond just post-communist region, which is fascinating for sure. But one of the goals is to demonstrate that the idiosyncrasy of the region is a little bit overstated. And as a matter of fact, we tend to see parallel processes unraveling across both Eastern and Western Europe, and of course the United States more broadly. Now, what's the book about? Full disclaimer, I should start by saying that I'm actually a student of Evgeny Yasin, who is a very prominent pro-market reformer in Russia. So I do not certainly have anything against the market per se. But the book does talk about political cost of adoption of pro-market or neoliberal reforms, in particular the austerity reforms, by a particular type of parties, especially the left parties. What essentially I argue shortly is that when left parties, social democratic parties, ex-communist parties, specific for post-communist region, adopt these radical pro-market neoliberal reforms, it actually ends up being quite consequential and costly for them in the long term. something that actually was not noticed by early studies of this process, which actually tended to celebrate the pro-market rebranding of many of the ex-communist parties, which used to be communists, but then rejected this Marxist dogma and adopted much more for liberal pro-market stance, becoming holier than the Pope sometimes in the embrace of the pro-market reforms, as one of my commentators in the book pointed out, ended up eventually de-aligning or pushing away the traditional electorates of the left parties. By traditional electorates, I mean economically vulnerable groups, working class electorates, or others who are not very nicely often described as transformation losers or modernization or globalization losers. These groups are the most susceptible to pro-market reforms because what are the pro-market reforms? We're talking radical decrease in redistribution, right? Trying to make the budget sustainable, decreasing the debt, perhaps elimination some of the social benefits. Usually those are the policies that are most important for economically vulnerable groups. And when their parties, the parties that they think are supposed to protect their interest, adopt these reforms, in the long term, this tends to push these parties away, these groups, the electorates away. And in turn, and this is the second part of the argument, that tends to provide an opportunity for other actors, often, as I show, populist right actors, who use a combination of redistributive appeals and also nativist, like anti-immigration appeals, to attract these electorates. As a result, we often see in the countries with so-called rebranded left parties, as social democratic parties declined in popularity, populist right parties grew. So these are not just coincidental processes. As I show, there's actually a causal relationship there. And I argue, to conclude, this is a very important dynamic to track because we actually don't want the populist right to be too strong in the societies. The adoption of very nativist agenda tends to be increasingly polarizing for these polities. The conflation of the competition along the cultural dimension and the conflation of economic liberalism with political liberalism allows these parties substantive after some time, consequently, to reject a lot of the important elements of political liberalism, hence the liberal democracy by Orban. So this is the dynamic that we need to watch very closely, given how consequential it has become for Europe and the West more broadly.
Yeah, I think one of the main factors when you look at European politics and the current sort of seeming instability of a lot of governments is that the coalitions of many European countries, European democracies, and this is in Western Europe in particular, were very, it was sort of very boring. There would be a center-left party, a center-right party, and they just sort of every once in a while flip-flop who is in power. But now creating a coalition can be much more difficult because we've seen the collapse of center-left parties in particular in places like France, but elsewhere. And I think one of the fascinating things to me is you note that there's, we tend to have thought about this as sort of a clear sort of Eastern European story, the rise of kind of illiberal parties, Orban, Law and Justice, the far-right party in Poland that until recently was holding power. And that it seemed to be a pretty clear narrative, right? You had the 90s, it was post-communism that created a lot of dislocation. The former parties in power became center-left parties, but adopted pro-market reforms, therefore became unpopular. But then also other cultural issues emerged. But what you identify is that this isn't simply an Eastern European phenomenon. And I think what we're seeing right now over recently, I think your book sort of predicted this or predicts this. I know you weren't working on it for a long time, but we have far-right parties that, the main party in the second most popular party in Sweden, for instance. So why do you think there's this connection between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, despite the fact coming from very different starting points, especially in the 1990s.
Yes and no. They're sort of coming from very different starting points. At the same time, they're actually coming from the same starting point. Now, first of all, the whole rebranding, the idea of rebranding, it started in the West in the first place. I actually start the chapter 1 by discussing the so-called third way, the rebranding which was actually pushed forward in the West by the Western left parties. Why did they suddenly decide to adopt more pro-market policies? That is because, first of all, it has become increasingly obvious in late 1970s in the West that these old school, hardcore Keynesian redistributive policies are not very sustainable. We'll remember great inflation, for example. So that wasn't going to work, especially in a world that was becoming increasingly globalized. So if you want to be competitive with countries like, China, you actually want to have more, less redistribution. You want to have a little bit less controlled economy and more openness in the economy, which in its turn was starting to erode all these social benefits that were offered to multiple groups. Plus, as these economies have become more post-industrial, so they transitioned away from this traditional industrial basis, the traditional electorates of the left party started to shrink. So there weren't just as many blue-collar workers anymore to vote for these parties. They realized they needed to expand their electorates, and that's why they started to slowly but gradually discuss this adoption of much more pro-market platform. One interesting example, rhetorically, is the switch, and you'll find it in many social democratic parties' platforms, from equality to equity. So it's like still equality, but not so much, that doesn't necessarily express itself in specifically social economic outcomes. Now, fast forward 1990s, at first it looked like for the Social Democrats things were working out nicely. They rebranded, and while they kept at first the working class traditional electorates, they were also able to expand into more middle class, upper white-collar classes, and therefore they were actually initially very successful electorally. At the same time, post-communist Europe starts to open up, and the old communist parties are faced with this dilemma where nobody likes them anymore because the communism obviously collapsed, and they really want to reject the past. There's a lot of great books, including Anna Grzymala-Büsse, who has worked a lot specifically on how this rebranding has unraveled. And at first, it seemed like a great idea. Everybody's rebranding, and these ex-communist parties, they have traditional electorates that have nowhere else to go, so they'll vote for them no matter what. At the same time, they may become more modern, more rebranded, and expand their platform by also attracting the middle classes in corresponding societies, which were just starting to shape. Now, one thing that these countries did not realize is that the composition of the electorate was a little bit different for the post-communist Europe and Western Europe. First of all, post-communist countries are, to a lot of, still quite industrial economies, and very often the industries were actually relocated from Western Europe into Eastern Europe. I have a chapter devoted specifically to composition of electorates, working class combined, like the groups that belong to those professions still constitute up to 2/3 of the electorate. And that per se actually made the rebranding of the left parties very, very consequential. In addition to that, these are the electorates with a communist legacy. And as we know from a lot of other work, this legacy left this affinity for distribution. So what kind of seemed to have gone more smoothly for social democratic left in the West was much more consequential electorally in the East. Last but not the least, in post-communist Europe, everything kind of happened at once, and the degree of transformation was much more radical. That's one of the reasons, by the way, why I started working on post-communist Europe too. Is just very convenient to study. There is just a very clear cut-off when everybody starts adopting reforms, and it's not as extended over time as we've seen in the case of the Western Europe. The process was somewhat delayed by the EU accession. Everybody wanted to be good students before the EU accession, so the electoral consequences of this rebranding wasn't felt until after the EU accession was secured in these countries. But once it was secured, this is when post-communist left parties felt really serious consequences of their choices. This is when the electorates said, "Hey, that's it. We can't take this anymore." As alternative actors, like populist right actors, emerged and appealed to these groups. In the West, we've seen this dynamic unraveling along very similar fashion, but it was much more extended over time and perhaps a little bit less consequential for the left parties just because of slightly different dynamic across both regions.
Yeah, of course, the EU accession for most of these countries in Eastern Europe happened in 20 years ago, in 2004. And so then the period that you are starting to see the backlash is actually before the 2008 economic recession, but then accelerates
even
after
further by the financial crisis of 2008. Exactly.
Yeah.
So you see these populist right parties start popping up and gaining in popularity straight right after the EU accession and all the way until now. Unfortunately, many of them are still quite successful electoral across the region.
Let me turn to Dan, but one more just question on this. I mean, it then seems the migration crisis that we then start to see in 2015 in particular in Europe is then sort of an accelerant, as you identify, not necessarily the cause of the rise of the far-right
Exactly.
parties.
And in general, one of the main kind of perhaps controversies about this book is I'm not denying the role of culture, but I'm certainly arguing that cultural dimension or is not everything that is to the story of the populist right.
Yeah.
Are populist right supporters like more racist, xenophobic, anti-immigration oriented than the rest? Potentially, but it's not why the populist right is more successful. As I show, in fact, absolute levels of xenophobia, for example, across the region, have not changed radically, at least throughout the period under my consideration, and yet populist right fortunes have fluctuated quite dramatically. So it's not explained just by the levels of xenophobia. It's something else that is happening there. And my major point is the populist right is the most successful when they combine two kind of elements that work particularly well for these lower, economically more vulnerable social groups. That is nativism, anti-immigration stances, and redistribution. It's very hard in general, I think, to divide, to argue that it's just culture and no economy at all, right? Because cultural argument is often framed, economic argument can often frame through cultural lenses.
Yeah.
For example, anti-immigration, right, argument. It's true that for many of these workers, blue-collar electorates, working-class electorates, immigrants, lower-skilled immigrants do constitute an immediate competition. So when they're anti-immigration oriented, it may be for cultural reasons, but it may be also for economic reasons. We don't know. And the same issue comes when it comes to nationalism. In many of these countries, populist right parties obviously embrace this more nationalist agenda, but nationalism also often has this very strong economic element to it. Like, we are the strong country, right? We will create our own economy. We don't have to depend on these multinational corporations that are stealing our profits, the products of our work, and we will stand alone in a position to globalization, etc., etc. Hence, my contribution is in particular to bring back the focus on economy. Economic arguments are not the only ones that matter, but they sure matter a lot.
Right. As we've seen a lot of parties say socialism for us, not for them. So in using in that, in some ways, it's a cultural argument about immigration, but it really has economic undertones. Dan, I want to bring you into this conversation and maybe to ask you generally, what are your take on this topic and also on Maria's book?
Well, thanks. And thanks for having me and giving me the chance to talk about Maria's terrific new book. I mean, my biggest impression overall, and I just read the book in the past few days, it's an incredibly impressive piece of work that's really rich empirically, kind of combining all the best methods in political science, a lot of data, statistical analysis, detailed case studies of Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and even experiments, these kind of survey experiments. So it's really state of the art and very convincing in the kind of argument that you just heard Maria articulate. And I think really what it does a better job of than any work I've seen in the field is two things. I think it provides, and you alluded to this, Max, it provides an integrated explanation that ties together the changes in party systems we've observed in Eastern and Western Europe under a kind of common framework. So that's the first thing. And also, it integrates in an impressive way, or in a kind of unified way, the two biggest trends in those party systems in East and West, which is, on the one hand, the rise of the far right, but on the other hand, the decline of the traditional center-left. There's, of course, a lot of literature on both topics, but sometimes it's a bit separated. And she shows how they really go together.
Dan, one question that sort of comes from the conversation from Maria's book, and I'll start with you and Maria if you want to jump in as well, but that this is not a region that has experienced economic hardship really over the last 20 years. You look at, for instance, the growth in Poland. It's rather exceptional how fast Poland has grown economically, and yet you have the far right in Law and Justice being the government, the governing party, and up until recently losing control, but still being the largest party, and so. I guess, does that complicate the economic narrative that there's actually been tremendous economic growth over the last 20 years? And so how do you think about this in terms of the economic growth that we're seeing, and yet the kind of economic discontent that I think is truly there?
It's a great point, and you're absolutely right that, as a whole, the region has experienced, in particular, the sort of Visegrad countries, those four, experienced a lot of growth in the past couple decades. Poland, maybe the most dramatic case. But nevertheless, the transition also produced a lot of losers, who Maria referred to earlier. So while, some younger, more educated workers who were definite winners from that transition, there are a lot of long-term losers who really suffered, and that's one element of the appeal. And those losers are sometimes regionally concentrated. There's the class base that Maria talks about, but you also see that play out in different regions. And I guess one little thing I'd add. This is almost a bit of a question for Maria, or what the one thing I'd problematize is sort of to say, while I think she does a great job of showing, the reasons why there was support for these populist far-right parties and a decline in support for the center-left, I do think it's striking that in some of these cases, let's say in Hungary and Poland, the populist center-right, once they got in power, of course, we saw them seize control over the media, manipulate electoral systems, all these kind of autocratic moves. And that kind of makes me question, well, if you're really so popular, why do you need to rig the system?
Maria, I'll throw that over to you. And I mean, to Dan's point that if democracy is working in your favor, you don't really need to work to undermine it. Is it because that there's that then they suddenly become the party of that's in power, and there's a reaction against them, and they're trying to hold on? How would you react to Dan's
both questions are great. So on Dan's question, that's why I point out that I explained the rise of the populists, right? Not the sustainability in power, right? The voters, as one thing we see from the analysis, I think, is that voters across the region, while perhaps the democracies themselves are fairly young, right? The voters demonstrate a lot of rationality to them, right? They're voting for the parties that actually seem to either cater or not cater to their demands. In case of Poland, for example, and Max, this is also to address your question, Poland was one of the one of the puzzles for me as well, because conventional economic arguments did not seem to work precisely for the reasons you flagged. Poland is actually one of the only countries in the region not to even have an economic growth during the 2008 financial crisis. So it really had no any serious economic issues, and yet you've seen the rise of the populist right. But the rise that happened even before the immigration crisis. So it's not the cultural argument also. So my point is that this is exactly where you need to add the political explanation, the political opportunities explanation into the argument. It seemed on paper that things were great in Poland, but if you dig deeper, you see that consistently parties that come to power, be they left or right, they keep implementing the same agenda. Economically, it means austerity, more reforms, more painful economic adjustment, and not so much of delivering on the social promises that they make while competing. So the so-called reform losers, they are repeatedly left without representation, and as a result, in the long term, the voters eventually get together and vote for the party that actually does cater for the interest, which the law and justice end up doing, right? We know that they did introduce, especially after 2015, this known policies such as Family 500 Plus, etc., and a number of policies which are somewhat redistributive, catering to this platform. Having said that, to Dan's point, it's one thing to win the election, it's another thing to stay in power for a while, and I think it would have been very hard for these parties to sustain themselves in power with these policies alone, which, by the way, the sustainability of these policies is actually quite in question when it comes to law and justice policies. At the time when I was writing this book, they were still in power, and many economists I interviewed, they were actually uncertain about how sustainable these policies are going to be in the long run, because they are not very pro-market for the reasons that I explained. So they want to hold on to power, and therefore they implement all these autocratic liberal policies. What is helpful to them, though, I already made this point, but I wanted to flag, they are assisted by the ability to conflate economic liberalism with political liberalism, because in the region, the economic openness coincided with political openness, so democratization coincided with marketization. Voters don't often distinguish between where the misfortunes come from. Maybe why am I suddenly worse off economically? Is that because of the market, or is it because the parties in power are all corrupt and they only represent the interests of the evil elite? And that provides that sentiment, and that double opening provided these actors the possibility to conflate political liberalism and economic liberalism in the eyes of their voters, and therefore, as they backlashed against economic liberalism, they also introduced a lot of politically illiberal policies that Dan has referenced. So at least in my book, I'm able to answer that question, that they're able to successfully conflate both political and economic liberalism in the eyes of their voters.
Dan, I saw you nodding along. I mean, it does strike me that the economic liberalism, that the far-right populists are not your sort of traditional economic conservatives, that they're reacting against the market liberalism. And do you agree that that also becomes sort of a glide path into both illiberal, but also sort of the strongman style politics that we have seen in sort of Viktor Orban's Hungary?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it has to be in the sense that some of the sort of welfarist policies, that they've embraced could have, and as Maria points out, have been embraced. We can imagine a different world where center-left parties went back to those or embraced those. I mean, the one element is the kind of welfare chauvinism aspect that Maria talks about, where that lends itself to the kind of populist thing, where you're emphasizing that these policies are only for the sort of real Poles or the real Hungarians, and you're trying to blame migrants or minority groups, whether Roma or things like that, for issues. So that side of some of these policies, or maybe the unorthodox policies like targeting foreign multinationals with special taxes to try to, underwrite some of this. Some of that plays into it, but I think, as she points out, the real issue is, it's the old saying, nature abhors a vacuum, and it's sort of when the center left basically abandoned this kind of welfare state agenda, not abandoned completely, but moved away from it more and more, and started being the actor implementing neoliberal policies. That created this opening, and then the far right cleverly melded these kind of welfare policies onto their far right cultural appeals and nationalism, and it worked. And it was a winning formula, as she convincingly shows.
May I just jump in quickly? Many things, Dan. I will just follow up on that by adding 2 points. First of all, I do only explain part of the variation, so I certainly see that the populist right, and I show that quantitatively, do get some of the supporters of the left, but it's definitely not. It's just a share of a fraction of all of the populist right electorate. So there is much more to the story, to which, among other things, Dan alleged. Obviously, there's more happening, and I'm not claiming I'm explaining everything there is to populist right. Second, as I show on the example of the Czech Republic and particularly Slovakia, we see equally situations or cases when left parties are able to, again, see an economic opportunity and jump at it, and the political opportunity. And this political opportunity emerges precisely when left parties implement these painful economic policies, austerity usually, which end up being de-aligning, sorry for the lingo, pushing away the traditional electorates. That means suddenly a group, large enough swath of voters are available for mobilization. And it depends really who is able, which other party is able to see that opportunity and jump at it. In Slovakia, for example, Robert Fico, Smer SD, has been equally quite successful. It was a splinter party of the similar social democratic party, the party of democratic left, which actually decided not to go with the flow. The party of the social democratic left in Slovakia actually continue to implement the reforms, often comparing themselves to surgeons who have to do the painful but important operation on Slovak economy. And Smer said, no, we're going to go in our different direction. And while doing so, they over time actually effectively defeated this more reformist left wing of the party. Similarly, as I show in case of the Czech Republic, the Communist Party, which did not really rebrand as much following the transition, also provided this counterbalance in the political system. It captured all these reform losers who otherwise would have been available for mobilization by populist right. And as a matter of fact, I show how over time, at least throughout these 2 decades that I trace, the war, various populist right parties, somewhat marginal, one of them Workers' Party, for example, a very telling name, by the way, also demonstrate which electorates they're competing for. They try to, again, mobilize these groups, but these groups were already incorporated by this left party, and so that provided a limited opening for the populist right at least until the immigration crisis started to unravel.
We haven't mentioned the EU that much, and that's sort of one of the common threads that links both Western and Eastern Europe. And Dan, one of the things that, oftentimes American conceptions of the EU is, well, the EU is this sort of socialist, left enterprise that is, about regulation. Indeed it is, but that it's about a sort of non-market-based economy. And in fact, it's the opposite, where the EU sort of enforces a degree of sometimes austerity, but sort of orthodox economics. And the Single European Act was actually Margaret Thatcher's, one of the main advocates of that in the 1980s, in really creating a single market. I'm curious if you see the kind of rise of the far right and the decline of the center left as being tied at all to the to the kind of constraints that are created by the EU. And do you think that this is an EU-wide phenomenon, and what is the role of the EU in the story of the rise of the populist far right?
Yeah, no, thank you. And I'll say Maria, I'm sure, will come in after. She has very insightful takes on the EU in the book as well. I mean, my own 2 cents. I think the first thing to say is just on this question, is the EU push right policies or left policies? I think, as you said, there's sort of 2 narratives about the EU, and that tells us something. On the one hand, let's say there was a big drive. One of the motivations for Brexit was that the Tory kind of right-wing free marketeers said the EU is a project of continental social democracy, strangling our economy with red tape and regulations and all this worker stuff, and we need to free ourselves up. On the other hand, from the left, if you're talking about more far left parties, they'd say the EU is a neoliberal project dedicated to this single market and helping big multinationals and hurting workers and unions. So what does that mean if you hear opposite accusations? Probably the truth is a bit in the middle, right? That the EU is a compromise engine and its policies are kind of more in the middle of the spectrum. And so when you look at it from one side, it looks left. When you look at it from the other side, it looks more economically conservative. Okay, so that's the first thing. But then I guess what I would say is this. It's definitely true that the EU, with the criteria imposed for Eurozone membership, so that was a big constraint for countries in the West, and then for countries in the East that were trying to join, various conditions that were put in place for accession, et cetera. The EU definitely was imposing constraints on economic models that pressured governments, including these left governments in some cases, to implement neoliberal reforms. So there's definitely truth to that. But I would say this. I don't think the EU is as constraining as it's often made out to be. Just because, let's think about it for a second. The EU contains within it a number of economic models, right? We have, sort of Anglo-Saxon type, more neoliberal economies like Ireland. We have social democracies like Sweden. So the EU, within the Union, there's room to pursue different policies. But I think often politicians also use the EU as an excuse or a scapegoat to blame for maybe policies they wanted to implement anyway because they've bought into these ideas and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I guess if you can be critiqued both from the right and from the left, sometimes that can help contribute to a populist narrative about you. But Maria, over to you on the role of the EU in the trends that you identified.
Well, I certainly echo all of Dan's points, but I do want to point out that in my book, the section on the EU is called "The Road to Hell is Paved with Good Intentions," which kind of already communicates some of the ideas. The EU is extremely important for the timing. The main puzzle for me was trying to figure out the timing of the emergence of the populist right, and just as we discussed, I thought I cracked it once I realized that really the timing of EU accession played a crucial role, because until then, it was not just the EU, as Dan has correctly pointed out, but also the natural desire of those societies to just really make it to the West, right? It was the EU membership is really the symbol of finally making it, right? Becoming part of the West, broadly understood. And as Krastev and Holmes, among others, point out, the momentum driving this, aspiration to join the EU, they sum it up by this motto: imitate the West, like whatever it takes. Slovakia's example is very illustrative because Slovakia was actually lagging behind throughout the 1990s in terms of the reforms. But once Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Poland have secured EU accession, they received more the roadmap towards the EU, and Slovakia did not. It created this huge momentum for many, many parties, not just left, but also right, in Slovakia to get together and finally replace a previous, more authoritarian government, which was in power throughout the 1990s. So certainly the EU, it was beyond just the EU, was just the inspiration of the societies. And it's also not just the EU, but also the IMF. The combined effect of both of those institutions, as I argue, was extremely important. But as the accession neared, once they secured the accession, several things have happened. So first of all, the carrots were like fewer, like less influential now that finally they got it, what they wanted. Simultaneously, the cost of the accession has become much more pronounced, and particularly consequential, at least according to my analysis, were the budget cuts introduced under the EU Maastricht criteria. There were a lot of protection policies imposed throughout the 1990s in many of these countries to protect local labor markets, among other things, which the EU accession, the reforms associated to the EU accession tended to erode, which in turn conditioned growing dissatisfaction across the societies. And again, when the accession was secured, it allowed a lot of leeway for various political actors to politicize this frustration. One good example would be Hungary's Fidesz, which actually, while they did adopt quite reactionist agenda already somewhat in late 1990s in response to the Bogar's package, the first austerity reforms introduced by the left. Once in power, they won the first election in 1998. They actually continued along the same pathway towards the EU accession because it wasn't secured yet. It's not until mid-2000 and later that finally Fidesz really starts to rebrand and adopts this increasingly more populist agenda. Most data sets do not classify Fidesz as populist until 2010, actually, but you can argue a little bit before, but certainly not in 1998. And this is when they become most successful also electorally. They're much more flexible now in what they get to say because it's not going to cost them EU membership anymore, as we see a few things at all seem to cost EU membership to Viktor Orban. He seems really immune in that regard. And they allow, essentially, they receive a lot of leeway. Slovakia perhaps is the most illustrative in the way the importance of EU accession tended to erode the support for social democratic left. It was precisely with the impetus of hurrying up behind the other Visegrad 4 countries that the social left in Slovakia adopted these reforms. They were in a rush. The reforms were painful. They were successful. They were extremely successful. Slovakia has achieved remarkable breakthrough economically, but it really cost the social democratic left the control. They did win subsequently re-election, but afterwards the party collapsed and was replaced by what you can argue is a populist left, essentially. Smer SD, still popular in Slovakia until now.
Does this create any lessons learned for the EU as it approaches potentially and hopefully, I think, a future rounds of enlargement for Ukraine or for the Western Balkans? I mean, it seems like there's a sense of national unity and priority to sort of get into the EU, and then once that's done, then there's sort of a backlash to some of the effort that was done. Maybe it's like you've done all this exercise and you've finished the race, and now you want to just eat all the junk food that you weren't eating as you were training. But I don't know, Dan, what are there sort of, as we think about this, lessons learned? Because I think throughout after enlargement occurred, there was sort of a backlash because if, seeing what happened in Eastern Europe with Hungary and with Poland, and the sense that, well, if you enlarge, you could be enlarging to more populist right. But now there's populist right in Western Europe. It's not a unique phenomenon in Eastern Europe. I'm curious if you think there's sort of lessons learned for the EU as it thinks about future enlargement.
It's a great question. And I think, if we go back through these rounds of, the EU imposing constraints and what the repercussions were, I don't think the EU really learned lessons, at least initially, from, any of the damage that its, Maastricht criteria or, different accession criteria imposed. We see that because then, when it came to the Eurozone bailouts, they all imposed even more onerous restrictions and, the troika and everything. But then if you look I think they finally learned some lessons from that because, then when it finally came to, let's say, the COVID recovery funds, of course, the context is somewhat different. But then I think you started to see a little bit more of understanding, in the EU, that you couldn't follow that same template of micromanaging, demanding cuts, et cetera. So hopefully, when you pull all that together, the approach to Moldova, Ukraine, Balkan countries, we can hope they'll take some lessons about the potential for backlash. But honestly, I think it's too early to say, and it really just depends on the governments that come through, because it's not just the EU or the Commission or bureaucrats that are really demanding these criteria. It's governments and the Council. The EU is imposing a lot of constraints, often because German governments, believed in them. And so we have to see, what are the other governments represented in the Council.
Dan, I'm glad you brought up the 2008 crisis, and because that seemed to, Maria, certainly give rise to the populism in the West, then fueled by the migration crisis. And now there's sort of a narrative, I think, that especially after the Dutch elections, where the far-right party led by Geert Wilders, where it was an election really dominated by migration issues. In Sweden, we saw something similar. That if there's now a debate that if the center of the political discussion is about migration, then the far-right does quite well. What do you think of that narrative, and do you think, how does migration sort of play in to the far-right? I mean, you pinpoint the economy, but now it seems like migration and immigration are really dominating politics on both sides of the Atlantic.
By its very nature, the populist right, for where I come from, is going to be more successful politicizing the anti-migration agenda. And first of all, I think more broadly, right, beyond this book, populism is somewhat of a democratic response to where corresponding electorates in societies perceive mainstream parties' failures, right? When they believe certain issues not addressed, there is this non-conventional, non-mainstream parties emerging, trying to take this agenda. Unfortunately, very often, the way they adopt this agenda is very detrimental for corresponding policies, specifically the far right. And in general, when the competition shifts to the cultural axis, we tend to get into the realm of identity politics, which is very polarizing. It's very hard for us to find common grounds this way. Therefore, I actually hope that the book will offer some policy solutions for the competition, to try and shift the competition back on the economic dimension, because it's much easier somewhat to find really acceptable policy solutions along the economic dimension, right? There are things to share there. I do make this point that when left parties try to radically rebrand themselves along the cultural dimension and compete with populist right on the specifically this anti-immigration platform, they unfortunately for them, they're not very successful, because they tend to break down the electorates, some of which may be willing to agree with this anti-immigration agenda, but others, usually more middle-class, white-collar groups, they're less susceptible to this agenda. So it's hard for the left to win back its traditional electorates without losing the white-collar support by adopting the anti-immigration agenda alone. More broadly, however, and this takes us back to the issue of the lessons learned for the EU, it seems, and the book is kind of hinting at it, that contemporary democracies are looking for a new balance, for a new status quo, because the old one, which relied on the social democracy, which emerged in the Second World War in the aftermath of the processes, which you could argue echoed something that we observe today, because 1930s in Europe was somewhat reminiscent in the sense that, again, you've seen a lot of disarray, crisis, and populist right far-right groups politicizing this resentment. In a lot of ways, that problem was resolved throughout second half of the 20th century by social democrats catering to the demands of the lower income groups. Globalization and all these processes that we have discussed, also immigration, which is part of the globalization, have eroded that status quo that emerged throughout that period. And one of the problems, I think, with the liberal democracy today is that the new ideal balance is yet to be discovered. Social democracy is not what it used to be. Globalization, immigration, they're destabilizing for this old status quo, but the new one is yet to be emerged. These populist right parties are politicizing this idea of coming back, like make America great again, essentially going back to the old status quo, but it's non-feasible under this new economic dynamic, most likely. So the real answer to this question, I think, is yet to be found. I think until we get there, we are to witness this quite tumultuous period for liberal democracies in the West with various types of political actors, unfortunately, politicizing it.
Right. I think, your book really points out the death of a lot of these major center-left parties, and that really seems, as we sort of look ahead, creates a degree of real political fragmentation, dislocation. It's sort of difficult to form coalitions. If you think about a number of countries, France, for instance, Macron basically destroyed both the center-left and center-right through the emergence of a new party, which then sort of unified the center. But then now in France, you have a party on the left and a party on the right and a party in the center, and the extremes. There's a danger that one on the extremes may win. So, as we look forward, Maria and Dan, do you see an era of just continuous sort of political instability where you have difficulty in Europe of governments forming coalitions? You think about the German government, Spain, for instance, with Pedro Sanchez, that in a more stable center-left, center-right situation in Spain, yet even that trying to form governments seems extremely challenging. So is this going to be an era fraught with sort of democratic political instability as we look ahead throughout the next decade? Maybe Dan, I'll throw that to you, and then to Maria.
Yeah, and it's a great question, Max. And as you said at the beginning, I'm speaking to you from Portugal, and just maybe start here. Portugal and Spain, I think across Iberia, these were two of the places where it looked like the center-left had pretty successful models, right? Despite the decline of center-left parties in so much of Europe. But then here in Portugal, a combination of scandal and other trends in society is now, we're about to have elections in March, but you're seeing this was a country where there was no populist far-right party, but now this new party, Chega, is looking to get, polls are saying maybe 20%. They're going to be the number 3 party. So it just shows you how quickly things can change. Spain, I think Pedro Sanchez's model is worth studying, how he's succeeded and might be a role model for others on the center left. But even there, it's a very close run thing. We know he's just barely hung on in the last elections. And I do think things will be fraught, because what you've seen in many of the party systems is this increasing fragmentation of the vote across more parties. And the real question is, how do you maintain kind of moderate pro-democratic coalitions, that exclude populist, potentially autocratic forces, especially on the right, but potentially in some countries on the left, like we have that in Greece. And so that then makes the calculus more challenging for those parties. And then there's a lot of temptation for centrist parties to ally with these radicals for expediency. And that can be very dangerous, as we know.
Right. It seems like one of the major questions dominating much of European politics right now is, how does the center-right party work with the right party? And you could see this in a future German election, for instance, where that will be a major question. It's the issue in Sweden, was potentially thought to be an issue in Spain, but then Pedro Sanchez pulled it out. But Maria, to you.
Yeah, certainly, as I have started this conversation with forecasting is not the strongest suit of political scientists. We are best at explaining why things happened the way they did. Having said that, one of the main takeaways of the book is that ideally for sustainability of today's liberal democratic policies, you want to split this electorate of populist right. And for that to happen, you need to have a viable redistributive left alternative on the other side of the spectrum, because that way at least part of these groups that otherwise would have joined the populist right electorates, they remain on the other side of the political spectrum, and that creates this like sort of checks and balances. Of course, like as Slovakia's case demonstrate, the left can also be populist easily, but usually less radicalized, less illiberal. The FISA, for example, has adopted also nationalist platform, but it's called nationalism light. At least throughout most of the period. So it's a little bit less polarizing, and the competition still unravels along the economic dimension rather than cultural dimension. So we are a little bit further away from this politicizing identity domain, which may become extremely dangerous, as we know from the history of the European continent throughout the 20th century. So unfortunately, no perfect recipes, and then, as correctly pointed out, all of the temptations and difficult calculus for the parties. But at least one lesson is clear. It's important to perhaps keep this electorate divided, and so there must be a competitive left, redistributive left option for these groups to go for. Having said that, overall, I remain optimistic, obviously, about the prospects of the Western democracy. I think there is a tumultuous period ahead. We're already throughout this period, in the midst of it. Eventually, though, if history is any example, any lesson, there will be a possibility for these parties to learn and perhaps to create new coalitions as the alignment and realignment of the electorates finally concludes with a new status quo.
And when we think about the populist right, I mean, we have around 5 minutes left, but has there been evolution in splits within the populist far right, or different categorization potentially, where some far-right populist parties sort of maintain the kind of, they don't sell out, so to speak, that they remain sort of very anti-system, very anti-EU, and then others start to sort of resemble more like a center-right party. And you could argue that, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, Brothers of Italy, a party with neo-fascist roots, from the far right, very populist. Yet, in some ways you could argue she's governing as kind of a conservative center-right politician. And so are we seeing kind of a normalization of part of the far right that then will make this kind of, the far right sort of bleeds into a traditional center right?
Yes, absolutely. We do see that, and that's one of the things that makes me hopeful. In general, as I said before, in my opinion, having studied populism for about a decade, I think it's somewhat healthy, it's somewhat unpleasant, but a healthy democratic response, right, to the existing problems, the ways electorates see them, right? The mainstream parties are not are not reflecting certain policy positions of these groups, and so there are non-mainstream actors emerging. But over time, these actors, at least some of them, have a tendency towards mainstreaming. It's a term in political science. So as the far right groups becoming more mainstream, it's very kind of ironic though, because this process is still in flux. In Hungary, for example, Jobbik radical right used to be the real far right, while Fidesz was more conservative. And over time, they kind of switched places. So in Hungary, this dynamic certainly did not unravel in the desired way. Now the largest party, Fidesz, is actually even more radical, as Jobbik actually has become more mainstream in an effort to expand its electorate, and even sided with actually social democrats in one of the elections in the past. So that actually is in process. But in general, yes, you do see this dynamic where formerly marginalized, radicalized actors are becoming more mainstream and therefore less dangerous for democracies. Another thing is, this is right up my rush, Russian, putting on my Russian hat, I also have done a lot of analysis of their position towards Russia. And the good news is that these parties are fundamentally, in my opinion, democratic in the sense that they're following the electorates. And while they used to be this big, they have this affinity with Putin's Russia, after the invasion of Ukraine, which really horrified many of the electorates, of even radical right electorate, populist right electorates across Europe, they shifted, as we've seen in Italy and other places. So they actually follow the electorates. They don't follow other. They're not maybe as, in a lot of ways, they're very opportunistic, but they're not ideological. And it has good news and it has bad news. The bad news is that, well, can we trust the electorates to make the right choice? But the good news is that there isn't like fundamental affinity with autocratic states there. It's more about what seems to be more politically feasible, politically attractive in the moment. And as long as we're able to keep their electorates in the mainstream, right, less radical, these parties will follow these electorates, hopefully, towards more sustainable liberal democracy going forward.
Great. Dan, any final thoughts from you?
I guess the one thing I'd say on this topic of mainstreaming, I think one has to be careful. Sometimes these parties also may sort of pretend or pitch that they're becoming more moderate in a desire to get in power. I think when PIS in Poland ran in 2015, they put Zidlo as their candidate for prime minister rather than Kaczynski, because they were saying, oh, this is a more moderate face. But then once in power, they sort of unveiled their full autocratic program. And so I think we have to we have to be wary. We see with someone like Le Pen kind of moderating, or in the Netherlands, Wilders, they're calling him Milders, like mild, right? Because he's pretending to be mild. But then you have to worry what they'll do if they really get control, in their hands on the reins of power. So that's one caution.
Well, Maria, thank you. I think one of my main takeaways, to quote James Carville, is that it's the economy stupid, and that when political parties take their eye off the economic situation, that tends to create real openings. But congratulations on what is a fantastic book. It is available at wherever you buy your books. You can buy it from Oxford University Press directly, or from local bookstores, or from other major online platforms. It is now available today. And additionally, if you like these conversations, be sure to take out your phones and actually subscribe to our podcast, Russian Roulette, where Maria and I co-host and have great exchanges with numerous experts on Russia and the war in Ukraine, and as well as our other podcast, The Eurofile, where we often hear guests like Dan talk about all the things that are happening in Europe. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Russian Roulette. We hope you enjoyed this episode and tune in again soon.
Russian Roulette releases new episodes every 2 weeks on Thursdays and is available wherever you get your podcasts. So please subscribe and share our episodes online.
And be sure to check out all the latest analysis by the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at csis.org.